The night Daniel signed the papers, he thought he was stepping into opportunity, not a trap. The neon lights outside the private club shimmered like promises. Wealth, status, a shortcut to the life he had always wanted but never quite reached. The men who welcomed him inside spoke softly, dressed sharply, and smiled like they already knew his future. They called themselves investors, but every word they said carried the weight of something darker. Daniel was a simple man compared to them, an office worker who had married into a modest family. His wife, Lila, believed in him more than he believed in himself. Her mother, Mrs. Mira, sold vegetables at a roadside stall every morning, her hands rough from years of honest labor, her eyes calm in a way that made people underestimate her. That night, Daniel was shown a guaranteed system, a game, a method, a secret pattern in high-stakes card tables that never fails if you follow discipline. The thugs didn't force him. They guided him. They made him feel chosen. By midnight, he had lost everything he brought. By 2 a.m., he had borrowed more. By sunrise, he owed more than he could even comprehend. And when he tried to back out, the smile disappeared from their faces. "You signed," one of them said, sliding the papers back toward him. "Now you play until we say stop." Daniel left the building shaking, carrying a debt that didn't feel real yet, but would soon consume his life. Within a week, Daniel's world collapsed into silence and fear. Phone calls stopped being friendly. Unknown numbers started calling every hour. Men stood outside his apartment without speaking. He stopped sleeping properly. Lila noticed first. "You're not eating," she said softly. "I'm fine," he lied. But nothing was fine. The debt had doubled, then tripled. The thugs claimed interest, penalties, system usage fees. It no longer felt like money. It felt like a cage tightening around his throat. One evening, Daniel finally broke down in front of Lila. "I messed up," he whispered. "I owe them everything." Before she could respond, a calm voice came from the kitchen. "How much?" It was Mira. Daniel hesitated. "Too much." She stepped out, wiping her hands on an old cloth, smelling faintly of fresh coriander and soil from the market. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look afraid. She just asked again, quieter this time. "How much exactly?" When he told her the number, Lila went pale. Mira simply nodded. Then she said something that made both of them freeze. "I'll handle it." The next morning, Mira did not go to her vegetable stall. Instead, she wore a plain shawl, tied her hair back, and took a bus across town to a place Daniel had only heard whispers about. The same private club where everything had begun. Inside, the air was different. Heavily scented, overly quiet, like the building itself was waiting. The guards at the entrance laughed when they saw her. "Wrong place, Auntie." Mira smiled politely. "I'm here to play." They almost refused her entry, until she placed a small bundle of cash on the counter. Not much, but enough to enter. Word spread quickly inside the casino floor. A vegetable seller. Alone. Calm. Sitting at the high-stakes table, the same men who had trapped Daniel now watched her with amusement. "She'll last 5 minutes," one of them said. Mira sat down and touched the cards like she had been waiting her whole life to do so. And then she began to play, not recklessly, not emotionally, precisely. She lost the first round, then the second. The thugs grinned wider, but Mira's expression never changed. By the third hour, something shifted. She stopped reacting entirely. Every move she made became controlled, calculated, almost mechanical. The dealers started exchanging glances. The pit boss leaned forward. She wasn't guessing, she was reading. And adapting. By midnight, Mira had not only recovered her initial stake, she had doubled it. The thugs stopped smiling. They called for higher tables. She followed. Higher stakes. She followed. The casino's atmosphere changed from entertainment to tension. Whispers spread. Cameras zoomed in. "She's counting," someone muttered. "No," another replied nervously. "She's predicting." Daniel, who had secretly been brought there by Lila, stood near the entrance watching in disbelief. This was not the woman who sold vegetables for change. This was someone else entirely. Someone who understood systems, pressure, and human behavior better than anyone in the room. At 2 a.m., the first thug slammed his hand on the table. Cheating. Mira finally looked up. For the first time, she spoke louder. No, she said calmly. You're just losing. Silence fell. The casino managers intervened, reviewing footage, recalculating odds. Everything was clean. Too clean, Mira continued. By dawn, the casino's internal reserve for table liquidity was nearly exhausted. By morning, rumors spread that the house was losing to one woman. And by noon, the system began to collapse under its own pressure. Panic withdrawals, halted games, confused staff, and panicked investors demanding explanations. The same men who had trapped Daniel now stood in disbelief as their operations spiraled. One of them finally approached Mira. What are you? She stacked her remaining chips slowly. Her hands were steady, like she was harvesting vegetables at sunrise. I used to run numbers, she said quietly, before I sold vegetables, before life got simpler. The man stared at her. You were destroying us. Mira looked past him, toward the entrance where Daniel stood. I'm correcting a mistake, she said. By the time security escorted everyone out, the casino floor was in chaos. Tables were frozen, accounts locked, systems overloaded with unresolved payouts. Investors arguing, managers shouting, phones ringing endlessly. And in the middle of it all, Mira stood up, adjusted her shawl, and walked out as calmly as she had entered. Outside, the morning sun hit her face. Daniel rushed toward her, unable to speak at first. I don't understand, he finally said. Mira looked at him for a long moment. Then she placed a hand on his shoulder and turned toward the quiet road ahead. Mira's hand stayed on Daniel's shoulder for a moment longer than comfort. Not heavy, not light, but firm enough to remind him that everything he thought he understood about her had just changed forever. As the morning chaos behind them continued inside the casino building, with alarms still faintly ringing and people shouting in confusion while she calmly guided him away from the crowd without looking back even once, Daniel kept glancing at her face, trying to find answers, but she only walked steadily toward the bus stand, as if nothing unusual had happened. And when they finally reached, tears in her eyes, But Mira raised her hand slightly. Lana, stopping all questions before they could explode, and said softly, We are not safe here yet. Daniel's phone suddenly vibrated, non-stop unknown numbers flashing again and again. But this time, Mira took it from his hand and answered it herself in a calm voice that did not match the fear the caller expected, and on the other end, a furious voice threatened her, saying she had ruined their system, and they would collect every penny from Daniel, no matter what. But Mira simply listened and then replied quietly, Tell your boss I was once the one who built that system. There was a long silence before the line went dead. And for the first time, even Daniel felt the air change, as if something much bigger than debt had just awakened. Lila stared at her mother in disbelief, asking, What do you mean you built it? And Mira finally exhaled slowly, looking at the horizon, where the city noise mixed with distant horns, and said, Years ago, before I sold vegetables, before I became invisible, I worked in risk modeling for underground financial networks. Not casinos, not gambling floors, but the structure behind them, the math, the psychology, the patterns. And I left when I realized what they would become, but they never forgot me. Daniel felt his knees weaken, because suddenly the debt he owed didn't feel like a random trap anymore. It felt personal, engineered, and precise. Mira continued walking, saying, They didn't trap you by accident, Daniel. They used a system I helped design, but I also know how to break it. And what happened inside that casino was not luck, it was correction. By late afternoon, the thugs had already started reorganizing, trying to understand how one woman dismantled their liquidity flow without hacking anything or cheating any system. But every attempt they made only exposed more losses, because Mira had predicted their recovery patterns and countered them in real time from the table itself. Daniel whispered, Why would you do all this for me? And she stopped walking for the first time, looking directly at him with tired eyes, and said, Because you are my daughter's choice, and mistakes destruction is not. And as they reached home, The city behind them was already whispering about the collapse of one of its hidden gambling circles, while inside a dim-aft Daniel were now staring at screens. We're now staring at screens showing spiraling losses, realizing that the vegetable seller they mocked was not just a player, but the reason their entire structure was beginning to fall apart. That night, the city didn't sleep quietly, as news of the casino's sudden instability spread through hidden networks and private channels, where people who normally controlled everything now spoke in rushed voices and broken confidence. While Mira sat in her small kitchen boiling tea, as if nothing outside her home mattered anymore, Daniel and Lila watched her in silence, trying to understand how the same woman who once argued over vegetable prices could now shake an entire financial underground without raising her voice. And Daniel finally asked in again, "What are you going to do now?" Expecting some complicated plan. But Mira simply placed 3 cups on the table and said, "I'm going to finish what they started." And the words felt heavier than any threat he had ever heard as across the city. The thugs regrouped inside a high-rise office, overlooking the river, where screens showed collapsing charts, frozen accounts, and disappearing liquidity. And their leader slammed his fist on the table demanding answers until one of the analysts nervously said, "The pattern is not random. It's adaptive, it's responding to us. It feels like someone is inside our decision flow." And that was the moment fear replaced arrogance. Mira, on the other hand, opened an old notebook at home filled with handwritten numbers and faded codes from years ago, when she used to design risk systems, and she traced her finger along lines that once controlled millions and quietly began updating calculations, not on a computer but in her mind. As Leela sat beside her asking, "Why didn't you ever tell us you were this?" Because power like this destroys families faster than debt ever could. But Daniel is already inside it. So now I have to balance it, and by morning, the thugs attempted their first counter move, injecting pressure into Daniel's remaining debt accounts, expecting him to collapse. But instead, the system absorbed it and redirected it in a loop that stunned their entire analytics team, as if every move they made was being mirrored and neutralized at the same time. And panic began spreading through their ranks, because nothing they tried was working anymore. And the leader finally realized this wasn't just a recovery. It was a controlled dismantling. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Mira sat quietly, sipping her tea, watching the sunrise, knowing the next phase would force them into a position where they would either surrender or lose everything they built, because the system they once used to trap people had finally met the person who understood every one of its hidden cracks better than they did. By the third morning, the underground network was no longer confident. It was desperate, as reports kept coming in from different cities showing the same pattern of unexplained losses and failed recoveries. While Mira moved through her routine like an ordinary woman buying vegetables from her own stall again, as if the chaos she had triggered belonged to another life. But Daniel couldn't stop looking at her with a mixture of fear and awe, because his phone rang. Instead, he received silence, and that silence and kind he expected threats had ever said before. And that silence was louder than anything the thugs had ever said before. Inside their headquarters, the leader gathered his remaining men and ordered them to bring Daniel in, thinking the son-in-law was the weak point in the chain. But when they traced him, they realized something disturbing. His accounts were no longer a liability but a controlled node, feeding back into their own system, and they could not separate him from the influence that was draining them. And one of them finally said, "She is not playing against us. She is inside our structure." And the room went silent as that realization sank. Mira, meanwhile, noticed Daniel's anxiety and calmly told him to sit beside her as she chopped vegetables at the stall, saying they will try something soon. Something emotional, not technical, because they are running out of numbers, and now they will try fear. And she was right, because by evening they sent a message not to Daniel, but to Lila, telling her that her husband's life was now collateral, and demanding he meet them alone at an old warehouse near the river. But Mira only looked at the message once and said they finally made a human move, which means they are losing control. And when Lila begged her not to let Daniel go, Mira. Enter Potris placed the phone down and replied softly, "He will go, but not alone." And that night she prepared something simple. No weapons, no guards, just an old file folder and a calm expression that made Daniel more nervous than any threat, because he realized she was not planning to fight them the way they expected. She was planning to end the game at its source. And as they drove toward the warehouse under dim streetlights, Daniel noticed Mira quietly reviewing memories, not of fear, but of systems and structures she once ruled, and far ahead in the same warehouse. The Isasa in the same warehouse. Thugs were waiting, convinced they had finally pulled her into a trap, not knowing the trap had already been designed. The moment they touched Daniel's life, the warehouse near the river looked abandoned from the outside. But inside it was filled with controlled chaos as the thugs prepared cameras, guards, and ledgers like they were about to witness the end of a hunt they had set themselves, while Daniel walked in beside Mira, feeling his heartbeat in his throat, because every shadow felt like a threat and every sound felt like a warning. But Mira's steps remained steady, as if she had already seen this place before, even though she had never physically been there, and the leader of the group stepped forward with a cold smile. And now everything would be settled in one final meeting, and Mira simply looked at him without emotion, asking quietly, "Is this what you call control now, forcing families into debt and calling it intelligence?" And the words hit harder than expected, because several men shifted uncomfortably, while the leader forced a laugh and said, "You don't understand the system, you only disrupted it." But Mira slowly placed her old folder on a wooden table and replied, "I didn't disrupt it." And then left. "Before you turned it into a weapon." The room went still as she opened the folder, revealing printed diagrams, old network structures, and code frameworks that looked like the blueprint of their entire operation. And Daniel realized this wasn't just financial knowledge. This was architecture of manipulation built years ago and now being shown like evidence in court. The leader's expression changed slightly of the system, and for the first time doubt entered his voice, asking, "Who are you really?" And Mira answered, "I was the one who taught your mentors how to turn risk into profit, but I never taught them to destroy lives, and you filled that missing part yourselves." And as tension rose, part yourselves, and as rose, one of the thugs tried to step forward, but stopped when Mira raised her hand slightly, not in fear but in command, as if the entire room was responding to an authority they had never formally acknowledged. And she continued speaking calmly, explaining how every debt cycle they used had predictable collapse points, how every intimidation tactic had emotional failure triggers, and how every expansion they planned had already been mapped in her notes years ago, which meant every move they thought was power was actually a loop she had already studied. And as she spoke, the monitors in the room she had already studied. Irregular losses again, this time faster, because their own internal systems were reacting to corrected parameters they didn't understand. And the leader finally realized something terrifying. They weren't negotiating with a victim. They were inside a correction process designed by the very person who understood how to undo everything they had built. And Daniel stood frozen, realizing that the woman who once packed vegetables for a living was not just confronting criminals. She was dismantling an entire hidden economy from the inside, without ever raising her voice, calm conseil, or stepping away from calm control. Excess, S. Inside the warehouse, the air felt tighter, as the screens flickered more violently. Now, and the thugs started losing control of their own systems, while Mira remained seated at the table, as if she had all the time in the world. And Daniel stood beside her, trying to process how reality had shifted so completely in just a few hours. As the leader signaled his men to cut the power, thinking it would stop whatever was happening, but the moment didn't react at all. And instead, she calmly pulled out a small battery-powered device from her bag. In the modern. That wasn't technology in the modern sense, but an old handheld calculator-style unit she used in her earlier days, and she began entering sequences that made no sense to anyone watching. Yet each input seemed to align perfectly with the failures occurring across their network. And one of the analysts rushed forward, shouting that accounts in 3 cities were collapsing simultaneously, and the leader finally snapped, asking her what she wanted. But Mira simply said, "I want you to understand something. You never built power. You only pressure, and pressure always returns to its source. Power." And as if responding to her words, the system logs showed their own internal transfers being redirected back into frozen accounts they had used to trap others. For years, Daniel could barely breathe as he realized the debt that once crushed him was now mathematically dissolving across multiple layers of their structure. And Lila, watching from the entrance, whispered in shock that it looked like everything was being in real time. And Mira finally stood up, slowly adjusting her shawl, because the Mira slowly adjusting leader, saying, "You used fear because you thought complexity would protect you. But every complex system has a simple truth at its core, and yours is built on imbalance. And now balance is returning." And the leader, in panic, ordered his men to stop her. But none of them moved anymore, because even they could see their positions were collapsing, as their own accounts were being locked by triggers they didn't authorize. And for the first time, the entire room understood that this wasn't a fight between people anymore. It was a full systemic reversal happening, in real time. And Mira walked toward Daniel Jelm, saying, "It's almost over now, not because we won, but because they finally reached the limit of what they created. And the warehouse that once felt like a trap now felt like the center of its own undoing, as alarms from distant servers echoed through the night like a system crying out while shutting itself down piece by piece under forces it could no longer resist. The final hours of the warehouse felt unreal, as if time itself had slowed down, and every second was stretching into something heavy and irreversible, while outside the river wind grew stronger. And inside, the thugs watched their entire network collapse in cascading failures that no emergency protocol could fix, because every backup system was already linked to the same. Corrupted beside her, realizing he wasn't just watching a rescue anymore. He was watching an entire hidden empire being dismantled without a single physical strike, and is watching an entire foams being torn. Leader of the group, now visibly shaken, stepped forward again, trying to speak with authority, but his voice broke halfway as he demanded to know what she had done. And Mira answered without raising her tone, saying, "I didn't destroy anything. I simply removed the false stability you were standing on. And everything else was already designed to fall once." Truth was exposed, and at that moment, one of the monitors showed the final warning cascading across all connected accounts, signaling irreversible liquidation across multiple, just failing. It was. Which meant their entire operation was no longer officially ending, and the realization hit the room like silence after an explosion. No one dared move, no one dared speak, because every decision they had ever made was now returning against them. In real time, Daniel looked at Mira and finally understood she was never fighting them for revenge or power. She was correcting a system that had grown too dangerous to exist unchecked. And Lila rushed forward, grabbing her mother's hand, asking softly, "What is now?" And Mira looked at her with calm, tired eyes and said, "Now everything go back to their lives." In Meevil, everything returns to where it started, meaning people go back to their lives. Without chains they didn't know they were wearing, and the leader finally dropped into a chair, realizing there was nothing left to control, as security systems shut down one after another, like falling lights in a dark sky. And Mira gently guided Daniel out of the warehouse, while the chaos behind them faded into distant alarms and broken signals. And as they stepped outside into the early morning air, Daniel felt something lift from his chest for the first time, not because the weight of it had finally stopped growing, and Mira walked beside him, but because the invisible weight of it had finally stopped growing beside him. Quietly, as the sun began to rise over the river, reflecting a world that was already moving on from the night that changed everything, without ever needing to announce its ending. The morning after the collapse felt strangely normal on the surface, but beneath it, the city was already shifting, as whispers spread through small offices, cafes, and hidden financial circles that an entire underground network had been wiped out overnight without any clear explanation. While Daniel, Lila, and Mira returned home quietly, as if they were coming back from something that only they remembered fully, and not the rest of the world. And Daniel kept replaying everything in his mind, trying to understand how a vegetable seller could carry knowledge capable of breaking systems built by powerful men. But Mira behaved as if she had simply taken a long walk and now needed rest as she prepared tea and placed cups down with the same chaos in the warehouse. And Lila finally broke the silence, asking her mother why she never told them the truth about her past. And Mira sat down slowly, looking at both of them before saying, "Because I wanted a normal life after seeing what knowledge like mine can do when it falls into the wrong hands." And Daniel listened carefully, realizing that her silence wasn't hiding power, it was protecting them from it. And later that day, unknown officials and investigators began appearing quietly in the background, asking questions about the casino collapse and the sudden financial disruptions. But every record they checked showed nothing illegal from Mira's side, only unexplained systemic failures that seemed to correct themselves. As if the structure had been unstable long before she ever touched it. And one investigator even remarked that it looked less like sabotage and more like a correction event triggered by exposure of hidden risk layers. And when Daniel heard that, he finally understood that the trap he had fallen into was never meant for just him. It was part of something much larger that had been slowly decaying for years, and Mira had only accelerated what was already inevitable. And that evening, as they sat beside her and said softly, "You saved me, but you also ended something huge." Sefin, and Mira looked at him with a calm expression and replied, "I didn't end anything that was strong enough to survive. Would have survived anyway. I only removed what was already breaking." And outside the window, the city lights flickered gently as life continued forward, unaware of how close it had come to a hidden collapse. And inside the home, for the first time in weeks, there was no fear, only silence that felt like recovery after a long storm, that no one outside would ever fully understand. Days passed, and the story should have ended there quietly. But instead, the consequences of what happened began surfacing in unexpected ways as Daniel slowly returned to his routine, while still feeling watched even in normal places. And Lila tried to rebuild a sense of stability at home, but the underground world had not fully accepted the collapse, and somewhere far away remnants of the network were trying to reconnect broken channels, kept hitting invisible barriers that seemed to anticipate their moves before. That seemed tron diferenis disnerens. Tom darenis da asti tomsi passness, ton im asti. They happened, and this time they were not facing confusion. They were facing structure that no longer trusted them. And one evening, a sealed envelope arrived at their home without sender details, containing only a single card, marked with old system symbols. Daniel didn't understand, but Mira stared at it longer than usual. And for the first time since everything began, not fear but recognition, as if something from her past had just reached her again. And Lila asked what it was, but Mira did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed the card on the table and said, quietly. They didn't disappear. They scattered, and Daniel felt a chill, because that meant the system she dismantled was never a single group, but a distributed network of people who had learned from her original work long ago, and now fragments of it were still active and trying to rebuild without understanding the limits she had once designed. And later that night, Mira stepped outside alone for the first time since the warehouse something streets, as if following something only she could see, while Daniel watched from a distance, worried but unsure whether to follow. And on. Inside her mind, she replayed old decisions from years ago, when she first helped design systems meant for prediction and control before leaving it all behind and realizing that ideas once released never fully disappear, they evolve in directions no one can fully predict. And when she returned home, she simply said, "Tomorrow we will see who is still left on the board." And Daniel realized that the story was not ending, it was shifting into something deeper, where the past was not finished with them yet. And the calm they were living in was only temporary, between movements of a larger unseen game that had begun long before Daniel ever stepped into that casino room. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath while Mira sat at the table again, reviewing the same old handwritten notes she had kept hidden for years. And Daniel noticed something different in her focus this time. Not urgency, but finality. As though she was no longer reacting to threats, but preparing to close a chapter that had been open far too long. And Leela watched silently as her mother carefully folded the mysterious card that had arrived earlier and placed it inside the same notebook. Within, Mira finally spoke, saying, "The people who sent that are not new. They are remnants of the original circle that studied my work before it was ever used in casinos or debt systems. And they never stopped trying to rebuild what they lost control of." And Daniel asked quietly if they would come back for them. And Mira replied, "They already have been watching, just waiting to see if I was still active." And that was when the air outside the house suddenly felt heavier, as if unseen movement was happening beyond what the eye could see. And later that day, a message arrived, this time through a different channel, confirming a meeting request, not with threats, but with respect, as if the remaining fragments now understood that force would not work against her anymore. And Lila became anxious, asking what they should do. But Mira simply said, "We will go, because running only feeds confusion." And Daniel felt a strange mix of fear and relief, because he realized she was choosing to face whatever remained, rather than let it grow in the shadows. And that evening, she prepared once again with the same calm discipline as before. But this time, there was no casino, no warehouse, only a location written on a plain card that led to an unknown place beyond the city, where everything that had started years ago might finally be acknowledged in full. And as they left together under fading daylight, Daniel looked at Mira and understood that what he once thought was a debt story had become something far larger, a confrontation with the consequences of systems, choices, and power that never truly disappear. They only change form, and now whatever was left of that world was calling her back, not as a victim or a player, but as the only person who could decide what the next version of it would become. The meeting place was far outside the city, in an old abandoned conference hall that once belonged to a financial research institute. And as they arrived, Daniel immediately felt how different this was from everything before, because there were no guards shouting, no flashing casino lights, no chaotic warehouse energy. Only quiet professionals standing at a distance, watching carefully, while Mira walked, held Daniel's hand tightly as they followed her inside, where a long table was already set with folders, old systems diagrams, and screens displaying fragmented data from networks that had once operated in the shadows. And at the far end of the room, a group of remaining leaders stood waiting, not with anger, but with controlled tension, as one of them finally spoke, calling Mira by a name Daniel had never heard before, a name tied to the original design team of the very systems that later became casinos, debt traps, and underground exchanges. And Mira did not deny it. She simply sat down and said softly, "You rebuilt something without understanding why it was limited in the first place. And that is why everything you touched eventually collapsed." And the man replied that they had come to restore order, not chaos. But Mira calmly interrupted, saying, "Order without balance always becomes exploitation." And the room fell silent, because everyone there understood. She was not guessing, she was confirming facts they already feared. And Daniel realized this was not a confrontation. It was a reckoning between original design and corrupted evolution. And one of the younger members asked if she would help them fix what remained. But Mira shook her head and said, "I already left that world once because I saw where it leads, and I will not rebuild it again." And that answer shifted the entire atmosphere, because now they understood. She was not returning to take control. She was returning only to decide whether anything of it deserved to continue at all. And Lila looked at her mother with both pride and worry, because for the first time she saw the full weight of a past that could not be erased, only acknowledged. And as silence stretched through the hall, Daniel felt that whatever decision came next would not just affect them, but the future shape of everything those hidden systems might become without her guidance or restraint. The room stayed silent after Mira's words, as if even the air was waiting for her final decision, and the remaining group of system builders exchanged uneasy looks, because for the first time they were not dealing with conflict or negotiation, but judgment, from the very person who once understood their entire foundation better than anyone else. And Daniel stood behind Mira, feeling like everything in his life had led to this single moment without him ever realizing it. And Lila held her breath as finally pushed a folder forward, asking, "What should we do now if you reuse? What should we do now if you refuse to rebuild it?" And Mira looked at the documents, the screens, the people who once carried her ideas forward and then turned into something else, and she said quietly, "You don't need me to rebuild anything. You need to decide whether this system exists to help people or control them. And if you cannot answer that, then it should not exist at all." And those words landed heavier than any financial collapse, because they were not technical, they were moral. And one by one, the screens began shutting down, not by force but by command from within, as the restraining leaders accepted the truth that, without correction, the structure would only repeat its past mistakes. And Mira slowly stood up and placed the old notebook on the table, saying, "This is everything I ever built and everything I ever left behind. Do not use it to repeat history." And then she turned toward Daniel and Leela and walked out of the hall without looking back. And outside, the wind felt lighter, as if something invisible had finally been released, and Daniel followed her step by step until they reached the road where normal life existed again. And for the first time in a long time, there were no threats, no systems from the world, hidden debts. Only silence and distance from the world that had almost consumed them. And Lila asked her mother if she would ever be pulled back into that life again, and Mira replied softly, "No, because some doors are not meant to be reopened once you understand what lies behind them." And Daniel finally exhaled, as if a weight he had been carrying since the casino night had fully disappeared. And as they stood there together watching the road ahead, Mira gently said, "Now we live like ordinary people, and whatever remains of that world must learn that began with debt and with me." And the story that Veggie-Seller ended not with victory or revenge, but the quiet closing of a system that lost its balance and a family finally finding peace away from the shadows that once tried to control their lives. Like, subscribe, and support my channel. I really need your support. If you enjoy my video, please share it and leave your feedback in the comments.